Lord as well too. So would you help me welcome David as he comes this morning?
It's always different from this angle. If I seem nervous, I am. You'll bear with me. So about half of what I was going to say, Pastor Chase already told you, so we're going to do a little review. I'll give you the cliff notes on kind of how I ended up here, and then we will proceed from there. As Pastor Chase mentioned, my folks are missionaries in Colombia, not Colombia, not South Carolina, South America, which is neither here nor there. But they got there in 1971. They went there with the intention of teaching in the Bible school. Well, when you get to the mission field, you've been to language school, you have approximately a second grade level of vocabulary. And so that didn't quite work out. And so they moved to a city called Bucaramanga. Have fun saying that 5 times fast. And about 6 years, one day later, I showed up, and their lives will never be the same. I'll let you take that however you want. So they worked in Bucaramanga for about 15, 16 years, helped start about 15 or so churches, and then moved up to Valledupar, which is up on the northern end of Colombia, there until about the mid-90s, and due to some political changes, the way that they've had a long history of dealing with communist insurgents, that kind of thing, and the government changed how they were dealing with them, and so we had to leave fairly suddenly. About the same time, my sister was diagnosed with a learning disability, and so it was decided that it would be better for us to be home so that she could get proper care. So we came home. Dad did a tour of duty at Southern Arizona Bible College, if you've ever heard of that little tiny college, and way like 3 miles as the crow flies from Mexico. Did that for a year, then we moved up to Trinity, if that's not a contrast, in North Dakota. He did a mission in residence there for a year, and then they got clearance to go back to Colombia. Well, that was my junior year in high school. And the trick with that is I was born in Colombia, and that makes me a citizen of Colombia. So if I go back, I can be drafted. And it's one of those that you either volunteer or they can draft you, and by drafting and set up random checkpoints and when you're not expecting it. And if you don't have your papers, congratulations, you get to be in the Army, and your family gets to find out 2 months later when you get done with boot camp. And so my parents didn't want that for me, and so I stayed back. Fortunately, one of my friends that lived there next to Trinity, his name is Mark, he and his family took me in so that I could stay there, finished out high school, and then I did my freshman year there at Trinity Bible College. So after that freshman year, my friend's parents decided to move, so they went back to Colorado, and I transferred to CBC, which is in this city, you might have heard of it, Springfield. So I went to CBC, I graduated in 2001 with a degree in pre-seminary, which is funny because I never got to seminary, so judge me if you like. After that, I started working for Resource and Development Ministries, which is part of World Missions. Did that for about 5 years, and then I moved over to the national office where I worked for the publishing division for since then. So if we can backtrack a little bit, back in about 2013, a friend of mine, his name is Mike Gonzalez, he's a CBC friend of mine. Some of the churches in the area asked him to plant a church in Rogersville, so he asked me to go out there and help him with that. So we've been friends for a long time, so that just seemed like a logical choice, so I went with him, and I served there for about 8 years as just a lay leader there. And in 2021, that church ended up closing. Nothing bad, it just couldn't get any traction. So we closed it down, and he and his family moved up to St. Louis, where they currently pastor Berea Temple International Church. And then I stayed here mostly because my folks are here and they're older, retired, and so I just need to be close to home. that was fall of 2021. I kind of hopped around from church to church for a little while. And last year, in August, I ended up here. Mostly because of a series that Pastor Chase was doing at Central Assembly, where he was covering the book that he's written, which I recommend, by the way. So that kind of brings it up to speed, and that's how I ended up here. So if you know me at all, you know that I'm not exactly an extrovert. I just assume be on the back row, listening and kind of staying out of the way and just being ignored. I'm perfectly happy doing that. So whenever I have to make a large change, like going to a new church, it's just one of those things I don't like to do because I'm introverted. And so it just always it's stressful for me. But the first Sunday that I came in to church here, it just so happened that Linda was here. And Linda and I go back quite a while. We used to work at the publishing division at the headquarters there for a number of years. I hadn't seen her for, 5 years or so. And so honestly, I didn't recognize her. I recognized the voice, but I didn't recognize her. But we chit-chatted and got caught up, and so it was just a point of connection. I sat on the back row, of course, and right in front of me was Jack and Cindy. And they looked awfully familiar, but I couldn't quite place them. Turned out, it just so happened that they had attended a church where my friend Mike had pastored in Willard a number of years ago, and so there was yet another connection. So when I'm looking for a church, typically the preaching is what does it for me. And that's, you could say that I'm kind of a sucker for expository preaching, which Pastor Chase definitely has in the bag, so we won't even go there. But having those connections to Linda, to Jack and Cindy, just kind of helped settle me in to be able to be comfortable. So, again, I'm nervous. So, to be honest, when Pastor Chase asked me to do this, I was a little apprehensive, if you want to put it that way. Public speaking really isn't the issue. I can do that. I went to Bible college. It's kind of part of, comes with the territory. But my faith journey in terms of the story to tell really is kind of boring. And I grew up in church. My parents were missionaries. Went to church every Sunday. We were in church. We did Sunday school. We did VBS. We did all of the things. I went to CBC. I got my degree. That was just normal. And so a lot of times, if you've been in church all of your life, you know that it just doesn't seem like there's much of a story to tell. Mm-hmm. It's just, blah, that's what you know. And so just didn't think I really had anything to say, to be honest. And so in order to actually have something to say and make this longer than 5 minutes, I thought I'd tell you a couple or 3 different stories of things that have happened throughout my life. First of all, we're going to go to a city in Colombia called Valledupar. It's on the northern end of Colombia, just off of the desert. If you want to think of the climate, it's something like Las Vegas. It's hot and dry, a balmy 100 degrees or so every day, which is kind of a contrast to the water supply for the city. Just up to the north of there is the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta. It's a snow-capped mountain where they get their water for the city, which is coldest, best water we ever had out of the tap anywhere that we've lived. So it's just kind of an odd contrast that in such an arid environment you would have really good water. While we were there, some of the churches in the area decided to have a retreat for the youth. And I was in my early teens, so I went. The retreat was in a farm just outside the city, and it was a working farm, so they had kind of like a barrack-style dormitory and a kitchen and a pavilion and that kind of thing, and a soccer field out in the back. And in the afternoons, when you don't have anything specific to do, you can just, as it is with youth retreats, you kind of roam around and do whatever. So we're sitting around chit-chatting, and in the back of the soccer field, there's a wood line, and this group of young men come out of the wood line. And they're in sneakers, t-shirts, that kind of thing, and they ask to use the soccer field. Well, no reason not to. And so they go and they play soccer, and I did whatever I was doing. It was so innocuous that it never registered in my mind as anything but some guys wanting to play soccer. They did their thing, played for a while, I don't know, half an hour, whatever, and they left. Didn't even register. Then we finished up the retreat, went back to town, didn't even think anything else about it. That's not the end of the story, but we're gonna put a pin there and we'll come back to it. So if you're type A, don't worry about it, we'll get back to it. So, Pastor Barry's probably gonna take me to the cleaners for this one, but we're gonna take a little trip back in history to 1776. You're familiar with the Revolutionary War. In about the end of August of that year, the Continental Army was just getting their backsides handed to them, and no other way to put it. They got pushed back to the edge of Brooklyn, and they've got nowhere to go. They've got the East River behind them, and the British Army in front of them. They're outnumbered 3-1, nowhere to go. So George Washington, with nothing else that he can do, decides to order a retreat. Well, retreating from Brooklyn is not easy. You've got the East River, it's got swift currents, you've got the wind coming from the northeast, which is keeping the British Navy at bay in the harbor, but it also means that you can't do anything with boats to get your troops out of the way. And so they go ahead and set up the retreat and just wait. There's nothing else they can do. About 11 o'clock that night, on August 29th, if I recall correctly, that wind that was keeping the British Navy at bay stops. One of the men that was there that day writes that it was almost as if by design. It just stopped, which meant that they could start bringing boats over. It calmed down the tides, so they just start bringing boats. They, under cover of darkness, they start ferrying people back and forth from Brooklyn over to the New York side, which today would be Manhattan, all night long under the cover of darkness, in complete silence. For those of you that have been in the military, you know that a tactical retreat is hard to do under good circumstances, let alone at night on a river that's a mile wide. But nonetheless, as if by design, they start ferrying people across. Some of the boats made as many as 11 trips back and forth across the East River. When it was just about sunup, they still had a couple thousand people left to get off of Brooklyn, and they're running out of daylight, and they know as soon as the sun pops up over the horizon, the British Navy's in the harbor, and they're going to make mincemeat out of anything that's on the river. But it just so happened that a fog settled in over Brooklyn. Not in New York, in Brooklyn. And it was so dense that one of the people that was there wrote that you could hardly see somebody in front of them at 6 feet. It was just that thick. And so that gave them cover to keep moving people. So they kept going. They finally got the last of the troops over on the New York side just after 7 in the morning. And about an hour later, the fog lifted. And the British were on the Brooklyn side looking through the encampment they had just left. It's one of those 1 in a million, shouldn't have happened, yet it did. So from there, we're going to go Just for reference, they had 9,000 troops, which they evacuated over the East River. They didn't lose a single soldier in that evacuation. And of course, the British were probably pretty surprised. So, well, that's one story. And you'll see the theme that's going to come through here in a little bit. Fast forward to the late 80s, early 90s. My dad, while we were in Valledupar, the city that we mentioned earlier, he did church planning, and so he did a lot of visiting of different churches in the area. And one of the cities he was going to go visit is Magangay. I'll let you look that up later, but it's a city just on the river. It's the Magdalena River. It's the equivalent of the Mississippi for us. It's a large river. About the best way to get there was to go by boat. In Spanish, we call it a lancha. It's basically an oversized canoe with an outboard motor. So, wasn't particularly thrilled about going by boat on the river, but that's how to get there, and so that's what we did. About mid-afternoon, they weren't sure if they were going to be able to take the boat because they didn't have enough people. And out of the blue, these guys showed up and just said they wanted to take the boat. And so since they had enough people, they went ahead and left. On the way there, one of these men that had gotten on late asked the guy that was driving the boat, "Oh, do you mind if we kind of take a detour over here and we need to drop off some supplies or whatever?" He's like, "Okay, I don't know where that is, but if you show me, we'll go there." So sure enough, they took their little detour, and mind you, this is a literal backwater. If you think of the movie Deliverance, the banjos just started playing, like that kind of backwater. They get to their drop-off point, and these men get out of the boat and they say, "Don't go anywhere, we'll be back." I don't know what they went to do, but they left. They were gone for several hours. While they're gone, one of the other passengers, a lady, leans over to my dad and says, "You do know who they are, don't you?" He's like, "Well, I think I do." So those are guerrilleros. They're communist insurgents. So I'll let you guess what they were doing. I don't know to this day. They go and do their errand, whatever that it was. They come back and get in the boat. By this time, it's dark. I mean, you're on the backside of nowhere, no street lights, no nothing. And the guy running the boat's like, I don't know how to get out of here. And so these same men say, "Well, we know the area." So they literally guided them out of this backwater in pitch black so that they could get back out onto the river and to their destination. So it's one of those, you get there and kind of breathe a sigh of relief sort of thing. But that's not all the story. A couple of years later, my dad was back here in the States and he was itinerating. And I forget what the name of the church that he was at, but one of the ladies in the church asked if you could speak with her after the service. Like, sure, whatever. So he was in conversation with this lady and she asked him, "Do you remember this day and this time? Do you know what you were doing then?" Like, "Well, I don't know." So he started thinking about it, and it turns out that that time, at that day and that time, my dad was on that river in the backside of nowhere, about this close to being kidnapped, and God had placed his name. She had never met him, but he put his name, which my dad's name is not common, it's Theron. So, for that name to just pop into your head is one of those 1 in a million things. So she was obedient, got up and prayed for him so that he could ultimately come home. He didn't know it. That was 2,000 miles away, but it just so happened that God had somebody in another country praying for him. So we'll go back to that first story that we didn't finish. After that youth retreat, I went home, didn't think about it. It was nothing out of the ordinary for me. Fast forward 20 years, and I'm living here in Springfield, and a missionary friend of ours asked me to come do some menial stuff around her house. If you ever met her, you would know her, Myrna Sue Wilkins. The Kendricks know who she is. She's a longtime missionary to Colombia and Venezuela. Single lady, wonderful lady, definitely a talker. She can tell you stories for hours on end. It's just her personality. And I'm over at her apartment just putting up a picture or whatever it was that we were doing. And she says, "Remember that youth retreat that you were at?" I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He says, thus and such, and explained it. And I'm like, "Oh yeah, I remember that." She's like, "Did they ever tell you what really happened?" I'm like, "No." And she says, "Well, the part that they didn't tell you, the proverbial rest of the story, is that those men that came out of the wood line weren't just locals wanting to play a game of soccer. They were guerrilleros, those insurgents we were talking about. They had come out of the wood line because they saw that I was there. Of course, being blonde-haired, blue-eyed, white kid, I stuck out like a sore thumb. And their intention was to kidnap me, which they didn't. I don't know why. I don't know if they didn't want that number of witnesses. I don't know if they didn't want the people to fight them off. I don't know if they saw some angelic being that nobody else saw. I don't know. I still don't know. But they didn't do it. It just so happened that it took 20 years for me to find out what didn't happen. Yes. I can tell you what would have happened if they had taken me. Because I was in no better shape then than I am now. And so having them drag me through the woods and who knows what else, running from the Colombian army probably wouldn't have been a good thing. Not to mention that the Assembly of God World Missions has a standing policy to not pay ransom. So lacking financial recompense for the kidnapping, they probably would have just done away with me and left me in a ditch somewhere. But it just so happened that they didn't take me. Let's go to scripture. In the book of Esther, which I found particularly interesting in this context. If you've listened to Pastor Chase's podcast that he does with the kids, Let's Talk Bible, there's a little piece in there where they say, I think it's part of the intro, it says the Bible was written in Hebrew, Greek, and a little Aramaic. Esther is the little bit of Aramaic. God is not overtly mentioned in the book of Esther. When we read in that book, we encounter Mordecai. Mordecai is Esther's uncle. And while they're in Babylonia, I forget exactly, the queen did something and she gets the boot, and so they start rounding up the nice-looking women of the area, and one of them happens to be Esther. And so she gets inducted into this, basically a Miss Universe pageant, if you will, but for keeps. And she gets selected to be the queen. And so while she's kind of going through that process, Mordecai's trying to be a good uncle and keep track of her. And so he's in the palace courtyard, and he just so happened to be at the right time and at the right place to overhear an assassination attempt on the king. So he gets word to Esther, she tells the king, they stop it, and he gets written into the annals of the kings. Well, that little incident ends up sparking another incident with Naaman, or not Naaman, I forget his name, my apologies, but yes, thank you. So they end up stopping this, and then he uses this as an excuse to basically take out, today you would call it an intifada, a hate job basically on all of the Jews in the land. In order to stop this, Esther has to go before the king. Well, she's kind of nervous about this, and I can't blame her. I mean, showing up unannounced in front of the king is potentially a death threat. If he's in a bad mood that day, you're done. And so she's obviously nervous about it. And Mordecai, in the 4th chapter, 14th verse, he says, "Who knows? Perhaps you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." It just so happened that God had placed Esther in that place in order to effectuate the deliverance of God's people. And of course he did. Because God is with us. God was with Esther and Mordecai. He was with George Washington and his men. He was with God, with my dad on that river. He was with me at that retreat. Because after all, he is Immanuel. He is God with us.